Welcome to Stories of Forgotten Lives. In today's episode, we journey back to 1912 to uncover the remarkable story of Joseph, the only black man known to have been aboard the Titanic. For more than 8 decades, his voice remained unheard until his daughter finally broke the silence at the age of 84. This is a deeply moving account, so take a breath, settle in, and listen closely. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, your city and country. Your support helps keep these lost stories alive. Now let's begin. On the evening of April 14, 1912, the most magnificent ship ever constructed was cutting through the North Atlantic at top speed. The sea was still, the sky cloudless, and over 2,000 souls lay sleeping soundly, unaware that within hours most would perish. Hidden among those passengers was a man whose tale would stay buried for nearly 100 years. His name was Joseph Laroche. He was 25, a trained engineer fluent in 3 languages, and the only black person traveling on the RMS Titanic. Yet his face has never appeared in films, nor his name in documentaries. For 83 years, he was forgotten, until his 84-year-old daughter decided it was time to speak, sharing what truly unfolded that night. This is a story woven with love, prejudice, sacrifice, and a promise left unfulfilled. It begins not at sea, but on a small Caribbean island, in a home filled with the scents of coffee and ocean breeze. Joseph was born on May 26, 1886, in Cap Haïtien, a coastal town in northern Haiti. At that time, Haiti was still grappling with years of political turmoil. Joseph's family, however, stood apart from the struggles of many. His father had served as a military officer and maintained ties to the government. His mother, Usuel, came from a respected lineage within Haiti's elite. Their home had wooden shutters and a garden blooming with tropical flowers. French was the language spoken at the family table. Joseph's parents placed immense value on education, believing that knowledge was the one possession that could never be taken. Early on, they recognized something exceptional in their son. His curiosity was endless. He constantly questioned how things worked. He would dismantle old timepieces simply to examine their inner workings. He would stand at the port, watching ships arrive, wondering how such enormous vessels could float. His mother took note. She understood that Haiti, at that moment, could not give her son the schooling he deserved. Opportunities were scarce and schools limited. So she held a vision. Joseph would become an engineer. Not just any engineer, but one trained in Europe. He would design bridges and machinery. He would return to Haiti someday and contribute to rebuilding the nation. When Joseph turned 15 in 1901, his mother made a life-altering choice. She sent him to France. This was no ordinary journey. In those days, traveling from Haiti to France took weeks. Joseph boarded a steamship carrying only a small suitcase and a letter of introduction from his father. He was quiet during the crossing, spending hours on deck watching the horizon, wondering what Europe would reveal. He had seen pictures in books and heard tales from relatives who had visited Paris. Yet nothing could truly prepare him for what awaited. When at last the ship docked at Le Havre, Joseph set foot on French soil for the first time. He was 15, alone, and black in a country where nearly everyone was white. From Le Havre, Joseph traveled by train to Beauvais, a city about 80 kilometers north of Paris. Here he would study and spend the coming years. Beauvais was modest in size, with cobblestone lanes and ancient stone buildings. Winters were bitter, far colder than anything Joseph had known in Haiti. But he adapted. He rented a small room, enrolled in school, and threw himself into engineering studies with a focus that impressed his instructors. Joseph was not merely intelligent, he was deeply disciplined. He rose early each morning, and studied late into the night. He mastered French grammar until his writing surpassed most classmates. He delved into mathematics, physics, and technical drawing. He was determined to prove that a black man from Haiti could compete with anyone in Europe. Yet France was not always kind to Joseph. People were courteous but aloof. Many had never encountered a black person before. Strangers would stare, whispering as he entered a room. Joseph learned to let it pass. He concentrated on his education, telling himself that once he earned his diploma, everything would change. People would respect his abilities, not judge his appearance. He believed this wholeheartedly, and for a time, it seemed possible. Joseph graduated with an engineering degree in the early 1900s. He felt proud, and so did his mother. He had achieved the dream she held for him. But when he began searching for work, a harsh reality set in that would shadow him forever. No one would hire a black engineer. It made no difference that his qualifications matched those of any white graduate. It did not matter that his French was flawless, or that he was capable and diligent. The moment employers saw his face, positions mysteriously vanished. Applications went unanswered. Interviews ended with the news that the job had just been filled. Joseph approached dozens of firms, engineering offices, construction companies, government agencies. The reply never varied no. This was France in the early 1900s. Racism was not legally enforced as in America. There were no whites only signs, no segregated facilities. But discrimination existed more quietly. It lingered in the way people looked at you, in doors that never opened, in chances never given. Joseph experienced it daily. It was slowly crushing him. Eventually he found employment, but nothing worthy of his training. He took menial jobs that paid little, hoping that hard work would lead to recognition. Promotions never arrived. Raises never came. He was consistently overlooked in favor of less qualified white colleagues. Joseph felt trapped, and despair began to take hold. Then everything shifted. In Villejuif, just south of Paris, Joseph met a young woman named Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue. Her father was a local wine merchant. She had chestnut hair, gentle eyes, and a smile that made Joseph forget his troubles. Juliette was white, her family French. In 1908, falling in love across racial lines was far from accepted. But Juliette cared little for society's rules. She saw Joseph for who he was, his intelligence, warmth, persistence, and she fell completely in love. They met through a family friend who had been mentoring Joseph. What began as polite conversation grew deeper over months. Joseph would visit Juliette's home. They would stroll through Villejuif's streets, discussing literature, aspirations, and the future. Joseph had never encountered anyone like her. She was curious about Haiti, about his boyhood, his mother, the ships he watched as a child. She listened in a way no one else ever had. Juliette's father was far from pleased. A wine merchant's reputation mattered. Allowing his daughter to marry a black man would invite scandal, harm his business, and make his family a target of gossip. But Juliette was resolute. She told her father she loved Joseph and would marry him regardless of his approval. Eventually, her father relented, perhaps recognizing Joseph's goodness or simply accepting defeat. On March 18, 1908, Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche and Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue wed in a quiet ceremony. He was 21, she 20. Despite every obstacle, they were finally united. The early years of marriage brought joy, but also hardship. Joseph still struggled to find meaningful work. Discrimination had not eased. In fact, it had worsened. Now he was not only a black man, he was a black man married to a white woman. Some regarded this with open disdain. They refused to deal with him. They made life as difficult as they could, yet Joseph and Juliette endured. They rented a small flat and lived simply. On February 19, 1909, their first daughter was born. They named her Simone. She had her mother's eyes and her father's smile. Joseph held her and wept, promising to build a better life for her. A year later, on July 2, 1910, their second daughter arrived. They named her Louise. Unlike Simone, Louise was fragile. Born premature, she was tiny and weak. Doctors were doubtful she would survive. Joseph and Juliet spent weeks at her bedside, praying and refusing to lose hope. Slowly, little Louise gained strength. She lived. But her health remained delicate, requiring constant care and expensive treatments. Joseph's modest income was stretched to its limit. The situation grew desperate. He worked long hours at low-paying jobs that barely covered rent. Juliet cared for 2 toddlers while expecting a third. By early 1912, Juliet was pregnant again. This should have been joyful news. But for Joseph, it was another weight. How would he provide for 3 children? How would he afford Louise's medical needs? How could he give his family the life they deserved? Then Joseph conceived a plan: return to Haiti. In Haiti, he would not be judged by his skin color. His engineering degree would carry weight. His family had connections. His mother still lived there and was respected. He could build a real career. He could offer his children the opportunities France denied them. Joseph shared his idea with Juliet. At first, she hesitated. She had never been to Haiti. She didn't speak Creole. She would be leaving her family, her homeland, everything familiar. But she trusted Joseph. She believed in him. She agreed to go. Joseph wrote to his mother, explaining the situation. She was overjoyed. She had missed her son terribly and had always hoped for his return. Immediately she offered help. She would buy tickets for the family to travel to Haiti and ensure they had everything upon arrival. A weight lifted from Joseph's shoulders. For the first time in years, hope returned. Originally, they planned to leave France in late 1912 or early 1913. But when Juliet's pregnancy was confirmed, Joseph decided to move up the departure. He didn't want her traveling too late in the pregnancy. He wanted their baby born in Haiti, surrounded by family. His mother purchased first-class tickets for them aboard a French ocean liner, the SS France. The ship was set to sail in April 1912. Everything was arranged. Everything seemed perfect. Then Joseph discovered something that changed everything. The SS France had a strict rule. All children must stay in the nursery during meals. They could not dine with their parents. This appalled Joseph. Simon was 3. Louise was not yet 2. They were babies. Leaving them with strangers while he and Juliet ate in a fancy dining room was unthinkable. It contradicted everything he valued as a father. He wanted to be with his girls, to watch them try new foods, to comfort Louise if she grew frightened. The SS France's policy struck him as cruel and unnecessary. Joseph refused to accept it. He went to the ticket office, requested a refund, and began searching for another ship. That was when he learned about the Titanic. The RMS Titanic was the largest vessel ever built. It was brand new, making its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. Everyone was talking about it. Newspapers called it unsinkable, a floating palace boasting luxuries no other ship could match. First-class passengers would enjoy a gymnasium, a swimming pool, Turkish baths, and restaurants rivaling the finest in Paris. Even second-class accommodations were said to surpass first class on other liners. And importantly, the Titanic had no such restrictive policy regarding children. Joseph could dine with his daughters. He could spend the voyage with them, being the father he wanted to be. So Joseph exchanged the first-class tickets on the SS France for second-class tickets on the Titanic. The family would board at Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912. From there they would sail to New York, and then take another ship to Haiti. It was a longer route, but Joseph didn't mind. He was thrilled. He was finally taking his family home. The days before departure were filled with activity. Juliet packed. Joseph arranged to vacate their apartment, bid farewell to his few friends in France, and wrote to relatives in Haiti, telling them to expect the family soon. Simon and Louise were too young to grasp what was happening, but they sensed the excitement. Their father smiled more. Their mother hummed while folding clothes. Something wonderful was about to happen. On the morning of April 10, 1912, the Laroche family traveled by train to Cherbourg. Cherbourg was a port on France's northern coast, known for its deep harbor. The Titanic was too large to dock at the pier, so passengers had to be ferried out on smaller boats called tenders. The tender carrying the Laroches was the SS Nomadic, a sturdy little vessel painted white, flying the White Star Line flag. Joseph carried Louise in his arms as they boarded. Simon held her mother's hand, gazing around with wide eyes. Dozens of other passengers filled the boat, speaking different languages, dressed in finery. Some glanced at the Laroche family with curiosity, others with something less kind. Joseph noticed. He always did. But he refused to let it bother him today. Today marked the start of a new life. As the tender drew near the Titanic, Joseph saw the ship for the first time, and his breath caught. It was colossal, unlike anything imaginable. The black iron hull rose like a wall from the water. Towering so high, Joseph had to tilt his head back to see the top. 4 enormous funnels pointed skyward, painted in the White Star colors, buff yellow with black tops. The ship stretched longer than any building Joseph had ever entered. It looked permanent, invincible, as if it could never, ever sink. The tender pulled alongside, and passengers began climbing a gangway to the second-class entrance. Joseph helped Juliet, who was visibly pregnant. He carried Louise, now asleep, against his shoulder. Simon walked between her parents, clutching her favorite doll. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, the family stepped onto the Titanic. The sun was setting. Somewhere in the distance, the ship's orchestra played. And Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche, the only black man aboard, took a deep breath and smiled. They had made it. Their cabin was on E deck, in the second-class section. It was small but comfortable. 2 berths, a wash basin, and a porthole overlooking the ocean. The walls were painted white, the linens fresh. Compared to their apartment in France, it felt almost luxurious. Juliet sat on the bed and exhaled. The journey had exhausted her. Pregnancy made everything harder. But she was happy. She looked at Joseph and reached for his hand. That first night, the family ate together in the second-class dining saloon. The room was lovely. Oak paneling, white tablecloths, crystal glassware. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved between tables, serving course after course. Simon was captivated by everything. Louise slept in her mother's arms. Joseph tried dishes he'd never tasted. He laughed at something Juliet said. For a few hours, the discrimination and struggles faded. He was simply a father dining with his family, aboard the world's most famous ship. But not everyone was welcoming. Some passengers stared at the Laroches. A black man with a white wife and 2 mixed-race children was an unusual sight in 1912. Whispers followed, fingers pointed. Joseph caught fragments of conversation, words not meant for him but perfectly understood. He pretended not to notice. He focused on Juliet, on his daughters. He would not let anyone ruin this moment. Over the next few days, the Laroches settled into a routine. Joseph rose early, walking the decks, breathing the salt air, watching the endless ocean. Juliet stayed in the cabin with the children, reading, playing games, resting. They met for meals and talked about Haiti. Joseph described beaches, mountains, the house where he grew up, the food his mother cooked, the drums at carnival. Juliet listened, falling in love with a country she'd never seen. Other passengers continued to treat the family with a blend of curiosity and reserve. Some assumed the children weren't theirs. One woman reportedly thought Simon and Louise were Japanese because of their light brown skin and dark hair. Joseph overheard remarks in English and French. He understood both, but never responded. He never confronted anyone. He simply held his head high and walked on. He had spent his life dealing with people who thought themselves superior. He wouldn't waste energy on them. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, the Laroches attended a brief non-denominational service in the second-class dining room, led by Captain Edward Smith. Passengers sang hymns, prayed, gave thanks for fair weather and smooth sailing. Joseph sat in a back row with his family. He wasn't particularly religious, but he valued the moment of calm. He closed his eyes, thinking of his mother in Haiti, imagining her face when she saw him again, holding her grandchildren for the first time. In just a few days, they would be together. After the service, Joseph did something unusual. He went to the second-class smoking room, a space where men gathered to talk, drink, and play cards. Joseph rarely socialized with strangers, preferring Juliet and the children. But something drew him there that day. Perhaps he wanted to relax, to feel like any other passenger. He found a corner seat, ordered a drink, and watched the other men laughing. For a moment, he felt he belonged. That evening, the family had their final dinner together. The menu featured lamb, roast beef, vegetables, and desserts. Simon cleaned her plate. Louise fussed as usual. Juliet looked tired but content. Across the table, Joseph gazed at his family and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. These three people were everything. He had crossed oceans for them, endured discrimination for them. He would do anything to keep them safe. After dinner, Juliet took the children back to the cabin. Joseph kissed each goodnight, told Simon to be good, whispered to Louise that Papa loved her, and told Juliet he'd be in soon. Then he returned to the smoking room. He wanted to savor the last peaceful hours of the voyage. Tomorrow, they would reach New York. Tomorrow, the real journey would begin. At 11:40 p.m., Joseph felt a slight shudder run through the ship. He looked up from his drink. Other men felt it too. Someone joked about hitting a whale. Someone else laughed nervously. The engines seemed to stop. The room went quiet. Joseph stood. Something was wrong. He could sense it. He walked out onto the deck. The night was freezing. Stars blazed brilliantly. Scattered across the deck were chunks of ice, small pieces glittering in the light from the ship's windows. Joseph picked one up. It was cold and wet in his hand. He looked toward the bow and saw a massive white wall scraping along the starboard side. An iceberg. Joseph dropped the ice and ran toward his cabin. He sprinted through the corridors like a man possessed, heart pounding, breath burning. The hallways, once elegant and welcoming, now felt like a maze designed to trap him. He turned left, then right, nearly colliding with a steward, walking calmly in the opposite direction, as if nothing had happened. The steward was young, perhaps 20, in a crisp white uniform. He assured Joseph there was no cause for alarm. The ship had struck some ice, but everything was under control. Passengers should return to their cabins and await further instructions. His voice was steady, his hands still, but Joseph saw something in his eyes that contradicted every word: fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. Joseph didn't believe him. He pushed past and kept running. The corridors were filling with confused passengers, some in nightclothes, hair disheveled, others fully dressed, carrying suitcases as if merely disembarking at a scheduled port. A woman wept nearby. A child asked unanswerable questions. The ship's lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Joseph felt the floor tilt almost imperceptibly toward the bow. Something was very, very wrong. When he reached the cabin on E deck, he threw open the door with such force it slammed against the wall. Juliet sat up in bed, eyes wide with confusion and dawning terror. Her hands pressed against her pregnant belly, as if protecting the child within. The children were still asleep. Louise lay curled in her small bed, thumb in her mouth, breathing slowly. Simon sprawled across her mattress, one arm hanging off, her favorite doll clutched to her chest. The impact had been so gentle it hadn't disturbed their dreams. Juliet asked what was happening. Her voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a woman trying not to panic. But Joseph saw fear forming behind her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed aside the blankets. He told her to dress the children warmly. They needed to go up to the deck immediately. He didn't explain. There was no time. Every second they stayed in the cabin brought disaster closer. Juliet moved quickly. 7 months pregnant, her body was heavy and slow. But adrenaline lent her strength she didn't know she had. She pulled a thick wool coat over her nightgown, grabbed scarves and hats, wrapped Simon in a blanket, lifting her from the bed with a mother's practiced ease. Simon murmured something and nestled against her mother's shoulder. Louise was harder to wake. She whimpered and cried when Juliet lifted her. But there was no time for comfort. Joseph grabbed the life jackets stored in the cabin. He had noticed them when they first boarded, tucked near the wardrobe, thinking nothing of them, a formality for a danger that would never come. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone said so. The newspapers, the company, probably even the captain. But now those life jackets seemed vital. Joseph pulled them out, examining quickly. They were made of cork, covered in white canvas, with straps tying around chest and waist. Bulky and uncomfortable. But they would keep a person afloat. He helped Juliet into hers, fingers fumbling with unfamiliar straps. He fastened one around Simon, who was now fully awake and crying. He held Louise while Juliet adjusted her own jacket, the little girl squirming and wailing. She didn't understand. She only knew something was wrong, and she was scared. The family left the cabin, making their way toward the upper decks. The corridors grew more crowded. Passengers emerged from rooms, some moving purposefully, others frozen in confusion. Stewards were everywhere, voices artificially calm, instructions maddeningly vague. Please proceed to the boat deck. Put on your life jackets. Remain calm. But how could anyone remain calm with the floor tilting? Lights flickering, the greatest ship ever built dying beneath their feet. Joseph led his family through the maze of corridors, up staircases growing more congested by the minute. He held Louise in one arm and pulled Juliet with the other. Simone clung to her mother's coat, small legs struggling to keep up, face pale with terror. The sounds were overwhelming. Crying, shouting, praying, distant crashes of something heavy falling deep in the ship. The groan of metal under stress, and beneath it all, a horrible subtle sound, water rushing into the lower decks. When they finally reached the boat deck, Joseph grasped the full scope of the disaster. The deck was chaos. Hundreds of passengers crowded near the lifeboats, pushing, shoving, crying, praying. Officers in white uniforms shouted orders no one seemed to hear. Crew members struggled with ropes and pulleys, trying to lower boats. Women screamed for husbands. Children cried for parents. The cold was brutal, far worse than anything in France. Every breath felt like swallowing ice. The stars shone impossibly bright, indifferent to the suffering below. And the ship's orchestra played. Joseph could hardly believe it. Amidst this nightmare, musicians stood on deck playing cheerful melodies as if at a garden party. The music felt surreal, clashing with screams and chaos. Later, he would learn they played to keep passengers calm, would understand their bravery. But in that moment, the music only heightened the horror. Joseph pushed through the crowd, scanning for a lifeboat still loading. He needed to get his family off this ship. The Titanic was sinking. He could feel it now, the tilt, the shifting gravity. The bow was going down, the stern rising. Time was running out. He spotted a lifeboat on the port side. An officer nearby shouted for women and children first. It was the rule of the sea, the code of honor. Men would wait, find another way, die so women and children could live. Joseph understood. He accepted it. But acceptance didn't make it easier. Juliet looked at him, tears streaming down her face, cold wind biting her cheeks. She didn't want to leave him. She grabbed his arm with a strength he didn't know she had, fingers digging into his coat, eyes pleading. Joseph shook his head. He couldn't. The officer watched. The rules were clear. If Joseph tried to board, he'd be stopped, thrown back, maybe shot. He wouldn't risk his family's chance. He told Juliet he'd find another way, that there were more lifeboats on the other side. He'd see her in New York. Be strong, take care of the children. Never forget how much he loved her. His voice stayed steady, but inside he was breaking, screaming. He didn't want to let her go, but he had no choice. The officer gestured impatiently for Juliet to board. Other women climbed in, faces white, movements clumsy. Juliet hesitated, looking at Joseph one last time, memorizing his face. He held Louise, her face pressed against his shoulder, small body shaking. Simon stood between them, looking up with uncomprehending eyes. Joseph handed Louise to Juliet. The transfer was awkward, complicated by life jackets, the crowd, the ship's movement. Louise wailed as she passed from father to mother. Joseph kissed her forehead, whispering that Papa loved her, everything would be okay. Then he lifted Simon into the lifeboat next to Juliet. The 3-year-old reached for him, crying. But something went wrong. In the confusion, the lifeboat began lowering before everyone was properly seated. Juliet and Simon were pushed to one side by boarding passengers, while Louise was still in Joseph's arms. He had handed her over, but somehow, in the chaos, she was passed back. Or perhaps he hadn't let go, savoring her weight a moment too long. The ropes creaked. The lifeboat dropped several feet, then stopped, swinging in the frigid air. Juliet screamed. She could see Louise still on deck, still in Joseph's arms, growing farther away. She reached out, arms stretched toward her baby, face twisted with anguish. Joseph tried to push forward, but too many bodies pressed against him. A crewman blocked his path, arms spread, face hard with suspicion. The crewman saw a black man approaching the lifeboat and assumed the worst. That he was trying to board, to take a place meant for women and children. He didn't see a father trying to reunite his family. He saw a threat. Joseph shouted, begged, pointing at Juliet in the lifeboat, at Louise in his arms. "That is her mother!"
"This is her daughter!"
"Please let me give her the baby." But the crewman didn't move, didn't listen. Seconds ticked. The lifeboat descended, and Louise remained on the deck of the sinking ship. In that moment, Joseph made a decision that would haunt Juliet forever. He turned to a stranger, a woman he had never seen and would never see again, and thrust Louise into her arms. Startled, the woman hesitated. But Joseph didn't give her time. He begged her to pass the child to the woman in the boat, pointing at Juliet, whose screams now pierced the chaos.
"That is her mother!"
"Please, save my daughter." The stranger looked at the crying child in her arms, the descending lifeboat. the black man with tears streaming. Then she leaned over the railing and passed Louise down to another passenger below, who passed her to another. A chain of strangers united by a single purpose, until the little girl reached Juliet's outstretched arms. Mother and daughter were reunited. The lifeboat continued down. Joseph stood at the railing, watching his family vanish into darkness. The lifeboat hit the black water with a splash. Crew members rowed away from the sinking ship. Joseph could see Juliet's face in the dim light, growing smaller. Their eyes met across the distance. She was crying, holding both daughters against her chest. She mouthed something he couldn't hear. But he understood she loved him. She told him to survive. Joseph raised his hand in a final wave. He tried to smile, wanted her last memory of him to be brave, hopeful. He didn't want her to see the terror inside, to know he had already accepted his fate. The lifeboat disappeared, and Joseph was alone. He stood there a long time, gripping the cold metal, eyes fixed on where the boat had vanished. The Titanic listed badly now, tilting forward. Water poured into lower decks through gashes in the hull. The bow sank, the stern rose. The ship was dying, and no one could stop it. Around Joseph, chaos continued. Passengers ran in every direction, searching for lifeboats already gone. Officers fired guns into the air to maintain order. Men jumped into freezing water, preferring quick death to slow agony. The orchestra had stopped. The lights flickered more frequently, casting the deck in alternating brightness and shadow. The screams of the dying filled the air like a symphony of despair. Joseph walked back toward the second-class smoking room. Perhaps he wanted somewhere familiar, away from crowds and screaming. Perhaps he needed a moment to think, to accept. The smoking room was nearly empty. A few men sat at tables, drinking whiskey, playing cards, waiting for the end. They had accepted their fate. Not enough lifeboats, freezing water. They sat, drank, waited. Joseph sat in the same chair as 2 hours before, where he had dreamed of Haiti, imagined his mother's face upon seeing him again. He thought of Juliet, Simon, Louise, the baby Juliet carried, the child who would never know its father. He thought of his mother in Haiti, who would soon receive a letter telling her son was dead. He thought of all he would never do, never see, never share with those he loved. And he thought of the life he had lived. 25 years. That was all. 25 years of struggle, discrimination, fighting for every chance. He had left Haiti as a boy, crossed an ocean for education. He had studied harder, worked longer, and still it hadn't been enough. His skin color followed him everywhere, closing doors, denying opportunities others took for granted. He had loved and been loved. He had married a woman who saw past his color. He had fathered 2 daughters and expected a third. He had tried so hard to build a meaningful life. Now it was ending on a sinking ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Joseph closed his eyes. He thought of Juliet in the lifeboat, holding their daughters. He imagined them rescued, arriving in New York, traveling to Haiti, starting a new life without him. He imagined his children growing, going to school, falling in love, having their own children. He imagined Juliet growing old, hair turning gray. He hoped she would find happiness, peace. He hoped she would tell their children about him, the father who loved them more than life itself. At 20:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic broke apart and sank beneath the North Atlantic. The sound was unlike anything survivors had ever heard. A deep groaning roar as the ship tore in two, a thunderous crash as the bow plunged, a moment of eerie silence as the stern rose vertical, pointing at the stars like an accusing finger. Then the screams. Hundreds upon hundreds, as over 500 people were plunged into water so cold it stopped their hearts within minutes. Joseph Philippe Laroche was among the dead. His body was never recovered. The lifeboats drifted in darkness for hours, surrounded by the cries of the dying. Passengers huddled together, bodies shaking with cold and shock. Some prayed, some wept, some stared into the darkness with empty eyes. The screams faded gradually as the cold claimed its victims. Within an hour, only silence remained. A terrible, absolute silence. Juliette held her daughters throughout the night. She didn't sleep, didn't speak. She held Simon and Louise against her body, trying to keep them warm, keep them alive. Her eyes never left the horizon, hoping to see Joseph in another lifeboat. He was smart, resourceful. He had promised they'd meet in New York. He never broke promises, but as hours passed, hope faded. Other lifeboats came together, sharing survivors, sharing grief. No one had seen Joseph. No one had seen a black man in any boat. Juliette's heart sank with each minute. She began to understand what she had refused to accept. Her husband was gone. The father of her children was gone. The man she had loved since girlhood lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Around 4 a.m., survivors saw lights on the horizon. A ship approached, the RMS Carpathia. A Cunard liner that had received the Titanic's distress signal changed course immediately, raced through the night at full speed, navigating the same ice field that had destroyed the Titanic. The captain pushed his ship to its limits, arriving in just over 3 hours. A journey that should have taken much longer. His decision saved hundreds. The Carpathia began picking up survivors from lifeboats one by one. Rope ladders lowered, crew members reached down, pulling freezing passengers aboard. Some were so weak they had to be carried. Some were unconscious. Some were children separated from parents forever. Juliette and her daughters were among the 706 survivors rescued. When Juliette climbed aboard, she immediately began searching for Joseph. She walked through crowds, eyes scanning every face, calling his name. She asked officers if they'd seen a black man, described him in detail: height, clothes, engineering books he always carried, his smile. No one had, no one could help. As hours passed, as the Carpathia completed rescue and turned toward New York, Juliette's hope died completely. She sat on deck surrounded by crying widows and traumatized children, accepting that her husband was gone. The Carpathia reached New York on the night of April 18, 1912. Over 30,000 people waited at the pier, reporters with cameras, family members holding photographs, curious onlookers. Rain fell, a cold drizzle matching the crowd's mood. Juliette walked down the gangway with Simon in one hand, Louise in the other. She was 25, 7 months pregnant, a widow, utterly alone. Charitable organizations took her in. The Women's Relief Committee provided money and clothes. The French consulate helped with paperwork. Everyone was kind, sympathetic. But kindness couldn't bring Joseph back. Sympathy couldn't fill the empty space beside her. Juliette stayed in New York for weeks, waiting, hoping, refusing to leave in case Joseph was somehow alive. But no news came. No body was ever found. Finally, she decided, she wouldn't stay in America, wouldn't go to Haiti. She would return to France, to her family, the only place she might find peace. In May 1912, Juliette and her daughters boarded another ship, sailing back across the Atlantic. The journey was a nightmare. Every creak of the hull made her flinch. Every swell recalled that night. Simon had screaming nightmares. Louise cried constantly, sensing her mother's grief. By the time they reached France, all three were broken. Juliette's family welcomed her with open arms. Her father held her while she wept. Her mother cared for the children. No one asked questions. No one forced her to talk. They simply surrounded her with love, waiting for her to heal. On December 17, 1912, 8 months after the sinking, Juliette gave birth to her third child, a boy. She named him Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche Jr., after the father he would never know. The baby was healthy and strong. He had his father's eyes. Dark, intelligent, full of life. Juliette held her son and cried, because he was beautiful, and because Joseph would never see him. Juliette never remarried. She dedicated her life to raising her 3 children, working multiple jobs, sacrificing her own happiness for their future. She never forgot Joseph. Every anniversary of the sinking, she lit a candle and sat alone in the darkness, remembering. She never spoke publicly about the Titanic. The trauma was too deep. When reporters asked for interviews, she turned them away. When filmmakers offered money for her story, she refused. She built a wall around that night and wouldn't let anyone tear it down. The children grew up in the shadow of their father's absence. Simone remembered fragments. Cold screams, her father's face at the railing. Louise remembered nothing, only what her mother told her. Joseph Jr. never knew his father at all. Only stories, photographs, the weight of a name carrying so much history. Decades passed. The world changed. 2 world wars came and went. The Titanic became legend, subject of books and films. But Joseph Laroche's name never appeared. His face never shone. His story never told. History had erased him, as it had so many others who didn't fit the narrative. Juliette died in 1980 at age 91, her silence unbroken. Simone died a few years later, taking her